Welcome back to How to Make Great D&D. So far, we've made great D&D ancestries, great D&D in general, and great D&D cities. Today, we're going to make great D&D encounters because encounters are, I don't know, it's like the jelly that keeps the whole beautiful cake together, because a bad encounter can mess up the whole pie. And hello, Chris. I haven't said hello to you yet, and I will say hello to the guests in a minute. But hi, Chris. How are you doing, mate?
I'm doing great. How are you, Paco?
Wow. If you say like that, absolutely no one will believe you.
That's all right.
That was
They
the
don't have to
least
believe.
enthusiastic.
They don't have to believe me.
I was like, yeah, I'm great.
I'm great.
When are we finishing this? I mean, I have a wall of painter that I need to watch dry. Please. So okay, how's about you're wearing a thick sweater? So I'm guessing that it's cold now in Austria.
Yeah, I think it's probably -2 or 3 right now.
Is that it?
Celsius. Yeah.
I'm kind of disappointed. I thought it would be a lot colder than that.
It's supposed to get down to -8, but it's not that. It's not there yet.
That's not a lot either. I think you still have an awful lot to live up to for Canadians. So keep getting colder.
I don't want to get colder, man. I don't want to get colder. It's cold enough.
I don't make the rules. And I live in a place where we have been to 20 Celsius up until yesterday. I was literally in short sleeves in the street.
What you mean is that my daughters could have gone swimming yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Probably even you would have been able to go swimming yesterday.
Yeah, 20 degrees probably, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, 20 degrees is that's spring. That is spring, and we are in the middle of December. This is completely bonkers and bananas, which is probably what both Shawn and Teos are thinking now about the show, since we have barely said any word about D&D yet, and that's what they're here for. So, Shawn and Teos, welcome. Seriously, very, very welcome. It's great having you around. And
good to be here.
Thank you. Okay, before we go into any, any kind of shenanigans regarding D&D, let's put you both into context, because both Chris and I know who you are. You know, me because I've gone online and so, I'm going to have these people on the show. Jesus. And Chris because he's known you for a while. So, but there might be people out there who have read your books and probably don't know who you are, because that happens in RPGs way, way too often. So, Shawn, tell me who you are.
Well, I live in Buffalo, New York, where I would take -2 degrees Celsius. I have been a freelancer in the role-playing game industry for over 20 years now, working on 3rd edition, 4th edition, and 5th edition D&D, as well as some other games. You probably, if you do know my work, you might know it from the Adventurers League, where I have written several million words, I think, or edited or produced them. Recently, I've also worked on a book called Acquisitions Incorporated with one Mr. Teos Abadia, wherever he ends up being. I also worked on Descent into Avernus, that adventure. I wrote a couple chapters of that adventure. And currently, I am the executive lead designer for role-playing games at Ghostfire Gaming, an Australian game design company that has produced a few Kickstarters now, several of them hitting the $1 million mark. So we're on a roll, and we're seeing what else we can do there. So I've been there for a couple of years.
Well, long may it continue.
And I should add that actually all 3 of us worked on acquisitions, but I was just an editor.
There's no such thing. There's no such thing as just an editor.
My God, I would seriously slap you now. I think editors are the most unsung heroes of the world of editing and writing and publishing, for goodness sake.
So what you're saying is that I succeeded at getting a rise out of you. That's great.
That's engagement. We're going to talk about that later.
Okay.
Foreshadowing.
So tell me about you.
Sure. I also started working in organized play. That's where I got my freelancing start. I do not work full-time in games. I work in the environmental field most of the time, being a reluctant boss on projects. But at night, I put on my cape and I write adventures, mostly, but other things as well. So I worked on Ack Inc. I worked on the HeroQuest board game. I've worked on a number of really fun projects. I feel very fortunate to work with great people like Chris Sims and Shawn Merwin. It's really incredible. So yeah, these days I also try to do a little beyond that. So I have a show called Success in RPGs on the YouTubes that is doing well, trying to talk about what it's like to make it in the business. And then Shawn and I both do the Mastering Dungeons podcast, which is superb fun. It is, I believe, someone at Ghostfire Game called it the #1 podcast that has 2 people.
Very impressive. I think it's also very impressive that you have the WizKids boat in the back, which is absolutely amazing. And I wanted to have it, and somebody got to the shop before I did, and I haven't been able to get another one. And I wanted it so bad.
Yeah.
So that's
it is. It's wonderful, and these days, as WizKid minis go, it's actually cheap. Let's say more reasonable than their later creations. So
yeah, I thought it was quite affordable, and that's why I wanted to get it, but it was a bit like, yeah, some asshole bet me to it. How inconsiderate.
I'll just cover, just put like, yeah, there you go.
No, that's fine. I can live with that. No way. Okay, so let's talk encounters, because as everything with role-playing games is probably a very difficult art to master, but once it's done, it's probably one of the things that guarantees that you're going to get a really great adventure. But for D&D, I think this is the first question that I want to throw at the 3 of you. Is for D&D in the top 3 important elements that you need to make sure you get right to get the proper adventure flow and quality out there?
It's an interesting question. Shawn?
I would say most definitely. I would say in terms of adventure design specifically, and game design in general, encounters are so important. The first reason being, if you're a game master or you're a world builder and you build a great world and you imagine a great story, unless you have encounters that bring that world out and bring that story out, the players are never going to see it, or they're never going to engage with it in a way that really speaks to the players. So when you're building your adventures, you need to think about how you're going to bring those elements of your story and your world into the adventure. And being able to sit down in an encounter and say, all right, how am I going to introduce these cool NPCs or this grand villain that I have? Doing that at the encounter level is a good way to ensure that step in the adventure design process gets done.
And I don't know how I'd rank it, but for sure, the way that those various encounters or scenes are going to come together, and what that flow is, what the branching structure is, what the story is that it tells, that high level thing. I like to think of it as a bunch of, because I always outline everything to death. And so, if I look at it as bullet points, where each bullet point is an encounter, and I've just got 2 sentences down, does that sound wonderful? That's a critical question, right? Like, that must succeed. It must succeed. If I tell somebody doesn't love a role-playing game, what I'm working on, right? And I just quickly say those encounters, they should go, that sounds really cool, even if they don't play games, right? Because it should just work at that level.
Chris?
Yeah, I think that Shawn touched on something that's, you could take it even to a higher level, and that is for almost all design, when it comes to the way the game is played. If it doesn't come across to the players, it might as well not exist. So the game occurs where the players and the game master interact, and the encounter is the tool to do that, right? So if when you're building a good encounter, its elements need to come across to the players, and so they can interact with it, and their story emerges from that interaction. So I think that that's the most important element.
Okay. Now I need to throw, and this is a very hard question. Okay, and it's going to sound to some degree even a stupid question, but it really isn't.
Well, let's hear the question before we
Yes.
know whether that's true or not.
Okay. No, I'm sure the answer won't be stupid, but the question may sound. But what is different between a D&D encounter and any other RPG encounter? What are the things that you really need to take into account? Teos, let's start with you now.
So other games often have a looser premise where they just say, hey, there's a submarine, there's a dock, there are enemy troops, you have to get on the submarine, there are these kinds of things going on there. And you just play around with that. And it might just be a couple of paragraphs, and that scene succeeds or fails based on how the GM interprets it and how the players react to it. And it could go really well at one situation or very poorly at another. And I think what D&D has migrated more and more towards over the years is to move away from that model and more towards a very defined encounter, right? Scenes that have very specific elements to them that are trying to maximize the return at every single table, right? So that almost every table runs more similarly or has the same kind of things guiding its play. And that's supposed to, when done well, work extremely well because you've done that very definitive experience. You've carved out a very crafted, purposeful experience.
Chris, how about for you?
Well, D&D is a fantasy adventure game. I mean, that sounds obvious, but the thing is that there are certain elements to encounters in a fantasy adventure game that are not present in other games. So you usually have monsters or cool NPCs and really like hopefully cool environments and stuff like that. And the fantasy element is at the fore. And you also have things like treasure, and it's more about exploration and interaction. It's not like a mystery game or a horror game. It can drift into that, but the focus is on 4 or 5, maybe 6 heroic individuals challenging and facing great danger, like any fantasy novel or genre movie.
Yeah, that's a good point about fantasy genre and movie or story. When D&D began, it really was modeled on fantasy novels, right? We came from Lord of the Rings, we came from Conan, we came from those sorts of things. And as society changed, as culture changed, as our forms of entertainment changed, we started thinking of stories more as movies or TV series. And so I think the way we structured adventures, especially if we carefully structured adventures, we started thinking in terms of scenes. Mm-hmm. And when you start thinking in terms of scenes, then you start thinking in terms of discrete blocks that we can put together to form a larger story. And so an encounter turned into sort of that one building block for this longer story that we're going to tell. And can you tell a story without having specific encounters that you think about carefully? Absolutely. DMs run games all the time where they're rolling things on random tables and running a fun game. So you totally can do that. But if you're writing an adventure for publication, or if you are trying to carefully tailor together, a longer narrative that the characters will weave their way through and build their own stories from, then you need to start thinking in terms of, what am I doing in this encounter? What information do the characters know coming in? What do they learn once they get there? What is their goal of this encounter? What could their goal be depending on the kinds of characters or the kinds of stories, backstories that the characters have? You can start thinking of these in terms of a movie writer or a television writer, where you're setting scenes, learning something specific from them, and then setting up the next scene.
Well, yeah, I mean, every encounter is really its own mini story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end, right? And what happens in that arc, you repeat that arc over and over and over again as you do encounters, and hopefully it's a good arc, right? And everybody's enjoying the trip. And then all of those things together form the larger arc of the adventure. I mean, it's just like a movie or a TV show or a novel chapter or a novel scene. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. If it's a good story, if it's written well, or if it's filmed well, or whatever would have you, you reach the end of that scene and you're like, oh, I want more. I want more. I want to go further. I want to go further.
And like a script, you want to trim it, right? You want to have the good elements in there that are going to make it super awesome, right? So that's why you have a lot of fights in volcanoes, right? It's because they're exciting areas, and lava is scary, and we all know that. And so we maneuver around it and we react to it. And all those, chases are fun, and those kinds of cinematic elements are the exciting pieces we want to get to. And we know there are spaces in between, and we might sometimes ad-lib those, but we don't need to detail those. We zoom in on the great scene in the novel, right? The chapter beginning, and then we move on to the next chapter, right?
And if you're talking about something for publication, the sweet spot for describing it is enough information. So like Teos said before, people are going to have a similar experience no matter who's running the game, a new DM or even a more experienced DM. Mm-hmm. So it has enough information, but without being overwhelming, without it being too, you don't want a wall of text for one encounter. So.
Yeah. And one of the things you can do as an adventure designer is to say right up front, this is the goal of this encounter. Right? Yeah, rather than making a DM new or experienced figure out what's the point of this. You can say the point of this encounter is to have the characters learn this information. And now you can role play. You can explore, you can have combat, you can have any sort of encounter or mix them all up, as long as the DM knows at the end of this is the important piece of this ongoing story that the characters need. Then you're ready to move on to the next encounter. Then the DM can ad-lib more, have some fun, making their own things, let players do what players do, which is do something that you don't expect. And you're still hitting that goal at the end of it, of that information getting across to the players.
I also feel like it's useful could be useful if you described the possible paths to the adventure. Do you just summarize them for the DM? Like, not the adventure, the encounter. So, they're like, you could, I mean, the encounter itself will describe these things, but often you're running it and you kind of forget that they could have flipped this lever and turned a trap on and won the encounter that way or something like that. And it would be cool it's cool to make sure that information is all clear, precisely conveyed.
The more complex the encounter is, the more critical it is to do that. And we've seen a lot of even official encounters written by good people who the encounter will say something like, in this encounter, there is the possibility of role playing between the enemy and the party, but then nothing actually facilitates that. So now the DM, if they remember this, has to struggle to do that. At least they got told that this is a possibility, but there's nothing in there allowing it. And then the flip side you see as well, right? Where there might be something in there that allows for this role-playing possibility, but the DM wasn't advised about this up front. So they're going to probably treat it as a battle right off the bat. And once you start smacking characters around, they don't tend to negotiate, right? So unless you really know to highlight that, right, then you have to do that. And so that's where the more you think about it, the more you think, all right, what I need to say up front is, this is going to start as a battle with the monsters hitting the characters hard. Then they will discover X, Y, Z, which should prompt them to open up a dialogue. When that happens, the bad guys will back off, right? And now we understand that is an expected reaction, and we're creating that experience. If we don't, we're probably just going to have a slaughtered bunch of bad guys, right?
Yeah.
So there's something you mentioned earlier. One question I have is, shouldn't every encounter have a point? I mean, is there any reason? Because I don't know you lot, but I used to absolutely hate when I started playing D&D, and we would have these random encounters when we were, going from one place to another. The sole point of having those was to weaken the party before arriving to where they actually needed to be at their strongest. I used to hate them. So shouldn't every encounter actually have a reason to be, have a point to be there?
I think so, to an extent, because even random encounters can be world building moments and can portray the world, can convey the way the world is to players.
Yeah, I'm generally not a fan of random encounters or pointless, there are goblins here kind of encounters. Because the time is short. And so I feel like there's always something to be said and accomplished. And I would rather spend my time creating one really good encounter that feels like a random happenstance encounter or a backdrop encounter, but I develop it well, rather than giving you 3 possibilities that you roll on the table to figure out, let alone 12. So if the point is, hey, this represents walking through the jungle, write a small encounter that feels like you happen upon things exploring through a jungle and convey those things about the jungle that you want to say, right? And create
I don't want to sideline the conversation, but I think that's what a good random encounter is. Like, even if you had random encounters in a product, a good random encounter in a product would be one that was detailed enough that you could tell a cool story and portray some part of the world with it. It's not just 3 were-rats jump out of the alley. It's like.
And were-rats jumping out of the alley can work, but the more that we think about, they're coming out from under the cheese shop, or something that points to the larger world, because what is the city about, right? Is the idea that the city's falling apart and that's why there are giant rats? Then let's do that. Or is this just some weird thing that happened? Like let's, might as well tell a story with it, right? And so those are the things that are so hard to do when you're just improvising. And some DMs are great at it, but a lot of DMs aren't. And then so you're putting them in that struggle position rather than empower them to portray the story. And if we think about it as a novel or a movie, you wouldn't just randomly film a scene. You're telling something, you're doing something, you're writing something for a reason.
You've missed several movies in these last few years, Teos, if you think that doesn't happen. I agree with everything that Chris and Teos said, and I will add that one way to make a random encounter, if for some reason you feel you need to run it, sing a little bit, is to put in something that's specific to one of the players' backgrounds, or one of the players' backstories. So rather than just having the were-rats come out, one of the were-rats has a dagger, and that dagger belonged to the fighter's sister who has been missing. And so now, even though it seemed like this had nothing to do with anything in the narrative that the adventure was trying to tell, something that this player can fall back on or pay attention to, it makes it feel a little bit more part of a coherent narrative.
Well, that gets into that whole engagement thing, right? Like, why should the players, let alone the characters, why should either of them care? And that needs to always be clear. And so when I'm looking at just an individual encounter, again, at the bullet point outline level, that's a question I ask myself. Why do they care to do any of this that I'm thinking about?
Going with that interaction thing, is it the most important bit of the encounter to build a good interaction with something, not necessarily a creature? Because and this is coming from somebody who is more used to running horror games, Call of Cthulhu, etc., where you can define an encounter not necessarily because you are going to run into a dip one or a shoggoth, which is something you very much want to avoid. Shoggoths are really, really nasty beasts. I don't know why people like them. You want to run away from them, but getting into a mansion, for instance, and just the idea of having to go through different traps and pick and locking, or going into a library and finding the right book or the right ingredients for the right ritual, that in itself can be an encounter, because there is some sort of interaction, even though it may not be with a creature, with a person, with anything at all. It doesn't have to be animate. Is it the same for AD&D encounter? That do you need to interact with something sentient or something reactive, or can it be just a scene where people develop the plot in a non-animate way?
No, I think that there are, and there should be, exploration encounters in D&D, and interaction encounters that are intended to be interaction and encounters that are intended to be fights, but also really good encounters mix the possibility of all of those things, like discovering something during the fight that can change the fight, or discovering something during exploration that solves some other mystery somewhere else, or gives you information that you need to talk to this creature over here and give them something they want, so they help you do this other thing. I mean, it's all interwoven that way.
Yeah, people have a lot of experiences these days, right? I think that maybe when some of us started, there was less out there that you were exposed to. And so I know when I played, Pharaoh, a classic D&D adventure, just interacting with that sort of Egyptian environment was just so much fun for me as a kid. But I imagine that there are a fair number of people who could come into that game today and say, I've seen a lot of stuff about haunted tombs and whatever, just having a scene where I find a tablet buried in the dust may not be much fun. And so these days, I think we want to step it up a bit and say, well, why does it matter that you found this, right? It's just not just finding something old. It needs to link to things. It needs to further things, have a real purpose. And again, it goes to that, why do the characters care, right? And why do their players care? And so you want to engage them, and it doesn't have to involve a fight. It doesn't have to involve, even talking to something. But if it requires some rolling and some engaging and some like, oh, all right, wait a minute. So that means this city used to have a different name, and we actually have found it, or something like that. Then those kinds of aha moments are great, right? And it makes the field world really neat and interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Paco used the term beat, and that's such an important word. And I've seen it used in so many different ways that I sat down one day, I was writing an article, and I tried to figure out all the ways that I've heard the word beat used in terms of like encounter design. And I've come up with 3, right? The first beat is it exploration, combat, or role playing? And how can you mix those up? Because you don't want combat if it's all the same thing. So using the different, even if you need 3 combats in a row, you can have combat where things change and you need to explore a little bit during the combat, or you can have a combat where you need to role play a little during the combat. I've seen beats used in terms of sort of upbeat or downbeat, in terms of like emotional resonance. So hope and then hopelessness, or fear and then glory, those sorts of beats. And what was the third beat? I lost it. Anyway, there's a third beat in there somewhere. One was that, one was, yeah, I think that was it. But you want to have different beats in all of those areas as you put your encounters together, to make sure that the players aren't seeing the same thing over and over again.
And actually, sorry, Teos, go ahead.
Just off of that whole idea of that, if you have a high pressure scene, right, that's going to work better if you were in a relaxed scene before that, right? Or the way horror does it, right, where you do the fake jump scare, then the real thing, right? Because we get that relaxed moment after the fake jump scare. We let our guard down, and then that's when it hits you, and you're like, and you weren't ready for it, and it's so much more impactful than if it had just been nothing scare, right? But the fake jump scare preps you, right? It's really great.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I like what you said, Shawn, earlier about mixing everything, because in a bit of exploration and combat, it can be really cool to actually go into the exploration with the possibility of the combat and actually wanting to avoid it. Let's not wake up the dragon. That can be, let's get that little egg that's under the wing without trying to wake him up, and that can be a very cool way of mixing everything together without having to go into combat. But if you step on the wrong gem, you may need to give some explanations. How are you going to manage that? Okay, so let's go into the nitty-gritty of actually designing an encounter. Firstly, and I know that this may not have a set answer, and it may be unquantifiable, but when you decide to build an adventure, how do you decide how many encounters you want to have, and what is a sweet spot for an unspecified adventure?
Well, I'm going to say for D&D, to me, the sweet spot is that whatever goal this series of encounter proposes, you can solve it in one adventuring day. And one of the reasons I say that is because a lot of times it just doesn't make sense to be able to retreat and come back to this place and find it in a state similar to what you left it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can plan for that in D&D. You can plan for, you can pace it. I use the word pacing. You can pace an adventure so it will result in this task being accomplished by one group, taking one day. By the time they leave, hopefully they're spent, but they're done, right? So.
Yeah, it depends if it's a one shot or if it's a big long campaign, right? There can be a lot of complicating factors to it, but for something that's like a one shot, generally it's 3 or 4 encounters that you can get away with in that time. Sometimes you can have an introductory scene on top of it, but you may be borrowing time from other encounters when you have 4. And that tends to be about what will work well with those kinds of 4 hours, 3.5 hours.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, if you're writing an adventure, it all depends on the scope or what's planned. I was asked to write 1-hour adventures at the start of the Adventurers League, and they wanted to have a full adventure, so beginning, middle, and an end, with different NPCs and different pillars of play, right? Combat and role playing, and they wanted everything, but they wanted it playable in 1 hour, not 1 hour and 5 minutes. Not 45 minutes, but 1 hour, because this was going to be played at Gen Con, at a convention, where people with tickets were going to sit their butts down at 8 a.m. And at 9 a.m., the next group of people with their tickets needed to be in their seats. So that was a challenge, because how do you make a full adventure in 1 hour? And then, sometimes we're writing full campaigns, like with Acquisitions Incorporated, where we had the luxury, if you will, of spacing it out any way we wanted. And then, as Chris said, then you figure out how much is doable in a day, because D&D, although it's getting away from it, is still a resource management game where you want to make the players feel like they are striving with urgency toward a goal that they need to finish before they can take a long rest. So then you can play around with the mechanics and the pacing of encounters in that sort of adventure.
Okay, I mean, I'm just thinking, you're talking with somebody who's made, quite literally, I'm not exaggerating. Me and my group, we've made a one-shot Call of Cthulhu adventure last 4 3-hour sessions. I mean, we are the definition of pedantically meticulous when we explore anything. And we are a nightmare for an overall GMs, because we just cannot do quick. We just don't.
So I call that success, though, right? So what I love myself doing is I feel like I write adventures that can be run in 4 hours that you would enjoy taking more time with, right? That is a good thing, because there's the depth there to expand on those scenes. And even something like Acquisitions Incorporated, we'll hear stories of what is already a fairly long campaign, right? And it will span many, many 4-hour sessions in just one of the chapters that in theory could be 1 or 2 times, 1 or 2 3-hour sessions. And people will spend multiple of that because they want to keep exploring the city or working this angle or doing whatever. And that's great, right? Like there's no problem there at all. That's not a failure. Unless, like Shawn's saying, if your job is to write an hour adventure that runs at conventions, with your DMs knowing to do this, it must be possible, right? And not just possible, but you need to facilitate that, right? Because it really needs to happen.
I actually love the experience of someone coming to you at a convention and talking about something that you wrote, an adventure that you wrote, and what they're describing happening is not something you wrote. Right? So it's something that their group experienced because of the way your creation interacted with their DM and their player group. And something new was born out of that I didn't create, and I've told people that, like, that sounds awesome, but you should thank your DM because I didn't write that, you know?
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile player time and character time? Because they're two very different things. I mean, how do you reconcile the amount of time that an encounter has to last for the players, because their time is way more limited, than for the characters who live in that world forever? How you do that?
Well,
yeah.
I think you go ahead, Teos.
Mm-mm. I'll follow you.
Okay. I think you fall back onto storytelling things you've learned over the ages, right? Even when you were hearing stories as a child, it was, once upon a time there was this, and you get sort of the background. So time has telescoped out. The princess lived in the castle for 20 years. Then this one thing happened. And so you focus in right on that one thing. And then it may, play out for several other years past. And then this thing happened. And, writing D&D adventures or writing any role-playing game adventures is sort of the same thing, where you focus in on the things that are going to grab the players the most. And then you let other things telescope out. Downtime, right? After an adventure, we're going to do some downtime activities that could last forever. And so you don't focus in necessarily on every single thing the characters do. And when you put encounters together, you need to think about what happens in between those encounters. Is there enough time for the characters to take a long rest between this one thing they did and the next thing? Because if there is, chances are they're going to take that long rest or that short rest, because that's what the game invites them to do to be at full strength. So even as you design those individual encounters, you always have to be thinking about time and what the story asks the characters to do or expect, or those goals, because they will move that time dial as much as they can to their own benefit.
And time's a great thing to be aware of on the player side, to ask yourself, okay, in this scene, this is going to be a place where the players are going to talk about this, right? So things like, there are 3 levers on the wall. There's a dead skeleton on the ground pointing at one of them, right? Players are going to take some time with that. And that can be fun, right? And it could just be those things that I described, in which case it's almost, there's really no information there, right? I wouldn't consider that a great encounter because that has no real information to work with. But if that's all it was, that the players would spend some time on that. They're going to make checks, they're going to discuss things, and eventually they'll pull a lever. Now, even better is if they can figure something out about what the skeleton's doing. Why is it pointing to one of them, right? Or is there a difference in some of the levers? Does this link to something you've said before? And that can take even more time, right? And that, as long as that's part of the fun, then that's great, right? The bad player time is if you have, like, say, a murder mystery, and they have so few clues that they're just sitting there arguing, trading clues because they don't know any of them. They can't quantify them, right? None of them can get enough points to rise to the top. So it's just endless back and forth. And I've run that table, sadly. It's a bad feeling.
Yeah, I think that good encounters facilitate the DM pushing the action forward, which is a way to maximize the time that players have, and to give them the information that they need to make meaningful. Teos was just saying, make meaningful choices, even if they have to discuss it, even if there's something secret here that I have to make a check to discover, that I get an advantage on making the decision later. A good encounter is going to contain all the information that helps the players make meaningful decisions, and helps them move the whole adventure forward. Yeah. So I think that's the way you basically maximize both times, although character time is a little less important and a little more nebulous than player time, really. I mean, and I think that good encounters can also facilitate closure. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that there's a point at which there's no point in taking more time with the situation, right? And then a good encounter will help facilitate the DM in bringing that to a close and then moving on.
Yeah,
What do you do are the magic words, right? What do you do? That's what do you do? And then the players sit and discuss, and then so you give them one more piece of information, and then what do you do? And if you're constantly, what do you do? What is your character thinking when they look at that? Give them something, whether it's role playing or a decision that needs to be made, or a timer that will spur them forward. But keep them engaged, keep their thoughts moving forward. Will keep their actions moving forward.
Yeah, my brain is spinning on Teos's skeleton lever scene. Like maybe one lever is pulled and the skeleton's pointing at another one. So,
and that's where I love, right? Like the game design process, right? You have some idea like that. There's a bunch of levers and the skeleton pointing at one of them, and then it's like, well, what is the right setup, right? That'll really make that awesome and engaging, right? And that kind of player time is super fun to allow them that space to think through it, right? Or any kind of tense negotiations in a city, right? Where this really matters. There's a thing that's going to happen, and factions are going to go swing way one way or the other way, and that choice of who you want to back can be 100% obvious, which to me is very boring, or it can be a tough choice. And then if you're making it a tough choice, players are going to have a blast arguing over this, right? Or I played a adventure many years ago in Living Greyhawk, where there were these ghosts tied to this region of the Duchy of Jeff, and they were from Keeland. So theoretically, our enemies back then. They'd been bound to this place to oversee it and guard it. Now this new threat shows up, and you get a choice. You can, at this Well of Souls, liberate those folks, kind of saying, "Hey, thanks. You did more than we ever asked of you. You defended our borders, forced to it. We're going to let you go, and you get to go to the afterlife. Or we need you to fight this big bad thing that's coming at the next big event for our campaign." And there was a third choice as well, right? And man, we spent 30 minutes, just big invested arguments over what the right thing to do was. And as one of my friends said, at the end of it, we knew more about our characters, right? At the end of the adventure than we started. We had learned how our characters, more about their personalities, right?
I hate to do this, but I'm going to give Teos some praise here. Teos wrote an adventure for Living Forgotten Realms where you had this choice, and we would have tables report
Surveys.
the results. So you could see via surveys what choices they made. And it would always be like 90% for this choice and 10% for this, or 95%. There was never... Teos wrote an adventure where they had this huge choice at the end of the adventure of 3 different things. And the final result was like 34, 33, 33. That's how you've written an adventure where there's a lot of information and exactly the stakes, but players are just torn about what to do. I had
a
beautiful thing to see.
My first version of that, I felt all very good, and I pat myself on the back. And then I said, well, I better check with this one friend of mine. I asked my friend Paul, can you read over this? He's like, oh, option B, duh. I'm like, what do you mean, duh? He's like, oh, it's so obvious. Like, this is better than that. And I'm like, okay, hold on. What about this? He's like, better. Like, then I sent it to him the third time, and he's like, now I don't know which one to choose. Yes. And that's how it ended up.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to talk about 2 different types of balance. Okay, one that I care a lot about and one that I don't give a monkeys about. The one I care an awful lot about is how did you strike the balance on the number or the type of encounters that you're going to include in an adventure? Because as you pointed earlier, if it's encounter combat, it's a bit like, give me something else. But if it is only exploration, it can be a bit... you need something else. How do you strike that balance in an adventure to make sure that it has enough off, but you give the players what they really want and expect?
So, I mean, to me, first, there's what the overall story is, right? And what that feels like. And so if it's a story of urban intrigue, then, if it's Romeo and Juliet with player characters involved, then that's a certain type of story, right? If it's, I don't know, Braveheart or something like that, right? Then that's a different thing. And so you have to start with that. What is that you're trying to hit? And then you want to play off of that and have it feel different enough across all those different pieces so that you're telling the right story in the right way. So though you're looking as at the outline level, right? I mean, and I don't start and then suddenly find where I finished writing and discover that. I do that at the front, right? You set up that outline of thinking through what are these different encounters going to be in this adventure? What will each of these scenes accomplish so that you end up with that satisfying conclusion? Right?
Okay.
Yeah, 2 days ago, I had to outline 4-hour adventures. And I went through and I said, okay, here we need a combat for sure. All right, I've already had 2 combats so far, so let me see what I can do. What's the point of this encounter? The point of this encounter is to learn this information. All right, so I don't need a combat to do that. I could do that with exploration or with role playing. I'm going to have a role playing one next. So let's do this as an exploration. So they learn that the secret that they learn is locked inside this chest, inside this bank. So this is going to be an exploration encounter of sneaking into the bank and breaking into this chest. And so that's how I figured that one out. Just to making sure that everybody has a chance. But as we said before, also, when you make the encounter, say you could do this via combat or exploration or role-playing in these various ways, and then you can let the game master figure out their players' preferences and let them do it the way that most speaks to them as players.
Okay. Yeah. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with both Teos and Shawn. I mean, how you strike the balance is what is each encounter meant to accomplish in the story. It's the same. It's similar to writing scenes in another medium, and that is, each scene is meant to each scene in a novel, for example, is meant to convey something to the reader. Each encounter in an adventure is meant to push the story of the emerging story, is what I mean. Not the story, not necessarily the story that was imposed on the that the adventure is structured around, but the story that's emerging at the table in a certain direction. And a DM, a good adventure and good encounters can also allow a DM to pick a thread that isn't exclusive. Like, there could be several threads that go through an adventure via the encounters, and a DM can pick one, or allow what gets picked to emerge from the way the characters choose their path. To me, that the latter is ideal, but
Okay, and now the balance that I don't particularly care about a lot about, but an awful lot of people do care about. How do you balance an encounter?
I love how reluctant you look. So.
Well, it's because I don't. One of the things, and this is something I've said to an awful lot of people. One of the things that really enthralled me the first time I saw the D&D cartoon series. Okay, I'm not talking about anything necessarily related to the game itself, but the cartoon series is that as soon as the dungeon master gives them their tools, their weapons, their whatever it is that the kids receive when they fall into Greyhawk, assuming that's where the world it is because it's Tiamat, and their Tiamat appears and bang, level 0 characters who have not even a clue how to use what they've been given or where they are or anything, and they can have an encounter with Tiamat and survive. Screw balance. I'm sorry, that's what I want. That's what I want. I want to be able to tickle an ancient red dragon under the wing and be able to survive it somehow. I'm not interested in, no, you're level 1. You can only fight kobolds, goblins, and perhaps a weekend orc who's going just a little bit, got the flu or something. I'm not interested in that kind of encounters. I want my characters to be able to do anything from the get-go, but people are so, balance. This is a challenge.
What I find I see all the time is DMs who struggle with balance, and whether they should be struggling with it or not, you see it all the time, right? They will post on forums, they will talk about it in gaming stores, they will talk about it at conventions. My players are running all over me, They just destroy everything I throw at them. And I would love to say it's not a problem, but it is a problem, right? And it is a problem for many, many DMs. And so when I write, I worry about balance because of those DMs. Their lives will be better when I give them the tools they need to challenge their characters, because challenge is a part of that story arc and a part of those beats that we talked about. So when I'm thinking through that plot and how it's going to go, there are going to be some moments where I think this should be a cool challenge. And I want the DM to be able to do that. Now, player characters can circumvent that. That's fine. And that can be plenty fun. But I want to enable the possibility of that as well as I can.
Okay. Shawn, how are you? What's your take on it?
Well, Teos is absolutely right. If you're writing an adventure that other people are going to use, you're creating a user manual.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that user manual needs to give the user, who is usually the game master, the tools for which to run what you had promised them when they bought the adventure. So in that sense, balance, it needs to be there. I gave up on things like challenge rating long ago. It's still a tool that you can use, but you can't be pinpoint specific, because I will write an adventure and I will send it for playtesting to 4 players who are known to not be great strategists, and they will send it back and say it's way too easy. And then I will send the same adventure to 6 players who I know are super optimized, and they will say it's too hard. So the roll of dice and the role of the game master and the role of just circumstances, in these games makes balance something that's, if not practically impossible, then just something that can't be mathematically put down in a book and held fast like it's a holy book. It's just there's too much randomness to worry horribly about balance. But what you do want to do is let, as a adventure creator, let the game master know that this is meant to be a tough fight.
Mm-hmm.
This is meant to be an easy fight. If it's going easy for your players, maybe the tough fight is going easy. Maybe this easy fight you add to later in the adventure, or vice versa, so that the game master can gauge what they are looking for. Because game masters can just triple the number of hit points, or they can roll behind the screen and they can hit on every roll if that's what they feel like they need to do to give their players a good time. So you have to rely on that game master to balance things as they go, as opposed to what you can do as just one person writing for a world full of players and game masters.
I'm a big fan of situational balance when I'm creating challenging encounters. And what I mean by that is that I know that the encounter has things in it that will make it challenging. So an example that's really easy, you can do at any level of play, is somebody else needs help on the perimeter of the scene. And it's a thing they will probably not ignore, right? So, the person who's trapped under the rubble, right? Just a common or whatever, and they're going to die because it's going to fall on them. The building's going to collapse. A character has to go off and handle that, probably for 2 rounds. You just removed a character from play for 2 rounds. Everything gets harder. It will always be the case, right? Now, they may be super powerful, but there are only so many ways you can deal with it. They've lost a character. There is a fog that prevents all of the ranged people from attacking effectively, right? That will cause a change and a difficulty, right? You will get, it's as if you had more hit points for all your monsters, right? Those kinds of situational things make big differences in encounters. And so you can use these kinds of tools to create that challenge, regardless of how tough the characters are. And then what you have to do, which just speaks to what Shawn was saying, is you have to let your DM know, this may make it hard. Here's how you can make up for that if need be, right? If this is going to be a pain, where you just, it's a party of 3 characters and one of them has to go save the person under the rubble. Well, here's how to balance that out.
And I actually wish the game taught that a little better than it does right now. But I also think that you can write an encounter to give the DM the tools to change the encounter. I want to say quote on the fly, because they aren't really changing it on the fly. If you've given them pieces of instruction on how to change something, then it's not really on the fly. They have the tool there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, the dragon is in a cave lair, and they're fighting in the cave lair, and they're beating the dragon because the dragon doesn't have enough room to move around. Well, have the dragon break through the roof of the lair. There's a collapse of the roof of the lair. That becomes part of the challenge. But now the dragon has changed its position, and the fight and the encounter just changes phase, and so the DM can make it a little tougher that way. But I think that encounters it would be nice if more encounters had those types of knobs to turn.
Yeah, for sure. And those knobs, I think we often feel as DMs like we don't have those knobs, and that somehow to use them is to cheat or to play poorly, right? And it comes especially because these days encounters are so detailed, they feel so crafted. And one of the things I try to say often to GMs as a creator is, don't think that the words I wrote are somehow the best way this could have been or the only way this could be. There is no truth to anything I wrote. The truth is at your table, and you should feel free to change any part of it that isn't working quite right. But a lot of DMs won't do that, right? And we've seen this in organized play, like an adventure will run and it'll TPK table after table after table because that's what was written. Just DMs feel that way. So you have to educate them. You have to say, here are some things you can do. You don't have to do this, right? Like Chris had a really neat adventure for Adventurers League where it was a black dragon that could go through like pools of acid or something like that and come out. So that's a really neat tactical thing. And some DMs will use that super, super effectively. And so it's good to remind them to pull back a bit, you know. The point is to murder your characters if you're a very good tactician. And then, you know, likewise remind those who may not super grasp the tactics, hey, you can do this, to up the challenge level. So it's fun. And telling people that helps, right? When you say like, you know, do this to achieve a challenge level, it'll be fun for your table, right? Those kinds of words really help. That's the point, not to challenge your characters, but to create a fun challenge, right?
Okay. So following on that, what is the amount of information that you need to include in an encounter for the players?
About half what I usually write.
I'm just going to say the minimum effective amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So minimum effective amount. It has to be effective, but no more than that.
And that's a big test to do. And I know we'd all of us here would recommend that if you are serious about writing encounters, you need to read lots of encounters written by other people, run them and see them run. And in fact, even preferably see your own work run over and over again, because that's where you really realize, yeah, I overcomplicated it. This DM cannot run it effectively because I just put too much in here. And you learn from that and you go, all right, next time I'm going to do it better, right? I'm going to explain better and I'm going to distill better so that it's just those neat elements and they're easy to use.
I know that Chris and I have both had the privilege and honor and sometimes horror of editing, right, adventures. And it's, you know, once you've read or run, like Teos said, several adventures, you begin to see, you know, not only did the extra 500 words in this encounter not add anything to it, it actually made it more confusing. So, and it's like that with any genre, though, right? You know, you could turn any poem into a haiku, and it would still be a good haiku if you did it right. So we can learn to pair out the things that we trust the game master to do. We trust the game master to know, and we don't need to say this. We don't need box text that flows and flows and flows. Box text can be important because it can get to the gist of the exact information that the players need, so the game master can trust it. And we don't need any more box text than that. And then we can just say what's in the room what's important. Is the encounter going to shift in tone or in content in the middle? If not, then just say, how does it start? How might it end? What's the possible paths through, and let it go at that.
Yeah, the funny thing is that when I was as an editor, I would say that 95% of the things that I edited got shorter.
Okay, but I need to go a little bit deeper into what is that essential, effective sort of information, because, and I'm sure that this has happened to everyone. I mean, I wrote an adventure that gave way to become a whole campaign setting because I added so much background information about the city to make sure that people could actually go into anywhere they wanted and investigate what was actually going on. The adventure alone was about 40,000 words, and it was an adventure to be run in 2 or 3 sessions. So yeah, there were 30,000 words too many in that adventure.
And that's,
how do you decide? I mean, I literally had to write 2 books, and I cannot get I cannot throw these people away.
That's organization, right? So if you did that by putting all of your city information in the middle of the combat encounter, right? Yeah. But if you put it in an appendix, or if you have a section that's, choose where to explore, and you give lots of depth, and this is something that the DM would read during their prep, that's great. In general, I think of an encounter as sort of starting with here's what this is about intro, right? And it's a DM reminder, right? As small as you can, but you need to say, this is what this is about, and here's what's going to happen in a really quick way, right? There are kobolds in here building a trap to fire at the characters. The characters can stop them, right? And then I like box text because you don't have to use it, but when you want it, you sure want it. And the box text, again, needs to be really short. You need to think that whatever you end with will probably be what the characters will go off of. So keep that in mind. And then after the box text, you need to give the DM what they need to jump into action as quickly as possible, right? Because they're going to read the box text, and what you don't want them to do is then sit there going, hold on, guys, right? So based on whatever is the premise of the encounter is, you want to organize the pieces below it so that they're as short and concise and logically ordered as possible. So maybe with the trap thing, I might say, so there's box text that lets the characters know, look, kobolds on the other side of this pit are building a trap to fire a giant weird ballista thing to fire at you. So, what are the kobolds? And we've got maybe, pointing to the stat block, and here's what it takes for them to build it. Here's what they'll do or not do. And then if the trap is built, can go lower, because that's not going to happen for a couple of rounds, right? And all of that has to magically be so easy to run that it's not overly complicated, right?
Okay.
And if it is complicated, then sometimes a summary is called for, like higher in the hierarchy of information. Like, these are the things that are happening. Go through these steps, then go back to the top and go through these steps, and then add this thing, and then go back to the top and go through these steps, and then add this thing or whatever, that type of thing. So
anytime it's complicated, it's worth asking, should I just dump all of this and do it differently?
Should I dump part of it? Yeah, should I dump part of it? Yeah.
Okay, because we're over an hour now. Let's start wrapping it up a little bit. Very quickly, I have just 2 questions. And the first question is, what are the definitely must-haves of any encounter?
Why the counter is important in the adventure.
Okay.
What the goals of that encounter will be. What challenge do the characters need to overcome in order to meet those goals? And what happens if the characters fail to meet those goals?
Okay.
I think for me, that sums up, if we're going to break it down into just the essentials, those things. Because a DM could then take that information and make lots of choices, but that's the flow of what the encounter means in and of itself and for the adventure.
Okay.
To that, I would add, especially since we're at the end of the show, the ending matters. And a good encounter has something happened because of what the characters did, right? What they did mattered. So reminding the GM why it matters and how to adjudicate those ongoing effects, right? They befriended the trap-making kobolds who can now build traps for them. This is how that manifests, right? Or they have wiped them out, and therefore the ballista cannot fire on the town, or whatever it is that's going on, right? Giving that sort of solid summary of the impacts of it is really important.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just going to add to those two great answers, fun.
Okay.
So you should know whether the encounter you wrote is going to be fun, like, or if it's just going to be a slog, or it's going to be confusing. I mean, it's hard to do. It's not always easy. That's something that you learn over time as you do these things, but it should be fun. It should. The whole point of this game. Well, I just said the word game. The whole point of the game is fun, right? Like, and Teos was talking about that a few moments ago when he was talking about tweaking it to be a challenge, but not murder, right? Being murdered is not fun. Being murdered in D&D is not fun. But everybody walking out of the encounter going, "Oh my God, I can't believe we made it. We made it." That is fun, right? So
yeah.
And the other question was the opposite. What actually are things that should never go in an encounter ever?
that's a harder question.
Don't tell the players what their characters do. Don't tell the player what their characters feel. Let them do that. So this is the only time I will use the word railroad, right? Don't railroad the characters. Don't move them without their consent. Let the players make those decisions.
Yeah, you've all stepped into a pit of acid when this happens. Like, wait, I did what? Why? Why did I do that?
Why did I step into the pit of acid?
I don't think I would have, and then anything that should go in an appendix should not be in your encounter.
Okay.
Anything that's auxiliary like that, right? That just eats up space and confuses people.
So I'm going to put a word to what Shawn was saying, and that is your encounter shouldn't editorialize. And what I mean by editorialize is some of the things that Shawn was saying, like telling the characters how they feel. But the thing is, that can be really subtle. Like the box text can say, "You recoil from," no, my fearless paladin doesn't recoil from anything, right? But it can also just use a word like revolting. It's revolting. I don't know if it's revolting to everybody that's witnessing it. Like maybe the devil worshipping tiefling warlock finds it fascinating. So even those little tiny things that you might overlook when you're especially writing box descriptive text that is going to be conveyed to the players, you need to avoid any sort of editorializing that basically is going to hint. I don't think there's anything wrong with hinting how somebody might feel if you can get that subtle with what you're writing, but anything that's telling them what they're doing or how they feel is right out.
One way to easily do that, although it flies in the face of what we've seen for the last 40 years of D&D, is when you write box text, don't use the word you.
Yeah.
If you don't use the word you, then that eliminates that ability to tell them what they're doing. You see, you feel, you think, you are, you move. If you get rid of you and just describe the scene as it happens, then that eliminates a lot of that, right? I'm playing a Grimlock character, so I have blind sense and I don't see. You see the train coming. No, I don't. I'm a Grimlock, right? So just get rid of that. The train approaches, and therefore that eliminates any sort of character internalization of what's going on.
And often that's the most efficient way to convey the information anyway. Like we were talking about efficiency before and using the time effectively and stuff like that. Often writing that way without editorializing is the most efficient way to convey the information.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, this has been an absolutely fantastic encounter. I have to say, which is coming to an end. So I will just say thank you very much indeed. I hope we can repeat this again. It would be great to have another chat about going even deeper about encounters and how to make it, how to blend